Hello, so I'm going to talk to you about politics because tomorrow it's the election. And if you are a swing voter and you're not sure who to vote for, which you probably are by now, this video is too late, I should have done it sooner. But whatever, if you are unsure, then this might give you a little bit of um, a kind of thought process to kind of check whether you should be voting for one party or the other or whatever. So I'm going to go through each of the parties and I'm going to try to be as objective as I can be. Obviously, I do support one of the parties more than the others, but I'm going to hopefully try to give a balanced view of it so that it's a little bit more objective and therefore helpful for you. So I'll start off with the Conservative Party because they're in power at the moment, they're the current government. The Conservative Party are all about business and capitalism, and they believe that if you give kind of like tax breaks for businesses or reductions in corporation tax, for example, for businesses, then what will happen is you will stimulate the economy, that those businesses will create jobs, and that will also create growth in terms of the economy, and then we'll prosper basically. So it's not, there's a little bit of prejudice that Conservatives are all about kind of like, supporting their rich millionaire billionaire mates or whatever. It's not really that. I don't think personally. I think it's more that their ideology is that they believe that that's the best way to stimulate the economy, and therefore the belief is that the riches filter down throughout. Which, if you kind of look at the country and society, I would argue that that's not actually happening, and that actually the people that are on the ground are not reaping the benefits from what's above, which is what the other parties are probably in reaction to that. Conservatives are also about austerity, so they're all about kind of trying to be fiscally responsible and trying to prevent the country from being in debt. Now, you could argue that the country's in debt because of the two world wars and because of us going into Iraq and all those kinds of things. All the kind of military stuff that has happened has put us into debt, along with the banking crisis, which again is not necessarily due to one government, because it happened worldwide. So there's lots of things that have happened that have meant that we're in, debt. It's kind of a natural thing that's going to happen. And I, would understand that it's necessary to be fiscally responsible. But the argument is that worth the cut into the services? So obviously, if you are, middle class, if you are kind of, if you own your own home, if you have money at the end of your outgoings to spend on things that you like, then you're not going to really be affected by austerity measures, that they're not going to have an impact on you, and you're probably not going to even notice that they're happening. They tend to happen to people that are at the bottom end of society, the people that are on the breadline, the people that notice kind of a cut to services. Anybody that's accessing services, anybody that's needs social care or NHS or anything that's kind of where they're having to use it regularly, they're going to be the ones that are most impacted upon, and that's not everybody in society. That's like a small portion of society. So the idea is that people would probably vote for Conservatives because it doesn't really affect them, and that they might believe in this ideology of capitalism and how if you work hard that you get rich. Now I would argue that you can work really, really hard and you don't get any richer, and you don't actually kind of get anywhere, and you don't become a billionaire. Like, why do some people get that and some people don't? So I would argue that capitalism is kind of it puts the emphasis on the person as being the reason for why they are poor or why they're rich, when in reality it's systemic and it's a lot more complicated than that. So I would argue that the Conservative policies are not for everybody, but they are for a section of society, which is why they have a majority, which is why they're in, which is why people voted for them. Whereas if we move on to another party, Labour, so the next kind of prominent party, they are kind of driven by socialism. So they're the complete opposite of Tories, because Tories are capitalism and Labour is socialism. Now, I'm not suggesting that socialism is the answer to everything, because if you look at history and you look at communist regimes, socialism and obviously socialism and communism are not the same thing, but they both believe in redistribution of wealth across everybody so that everybody shares, and they both believe in nationalisation of kind of services and kind of having that kind of control. The problem with communism is that it usually ends up with a dictator, which is a danger of socialism, and that's why a lot of people are against socialism. And there's also an argument, I don't know if you're familiar with Ayn Rand, she wrote Atlas Shrugged. Comes from Soviet Russia, and she completely disagrees with socialism and is for capitalism, because she believes that with socialism, if everything's shared, then nobody has any kind of impetus to improve themselves and to get better. But Labour's not completely, on that side, because they're suggesting things like, in fact, or is it not the Green Party that's suggesting a universal income? It might be Labour as well. But essentially that everybody gets an income, but then you can top that up yourself. So it's still on the principles of capitalism, which you can make yourself better if you want. So it avoids the problems of socialism that have happened in history. I think that the thing with Labour is they're a very kind of forward-thinking, well-researched party. A lot of their policies are informed by modern research. They do kind of take things into consideration. They do consult economists. If you look at their costing documents, it's done by economists. It's got a lot of explanation there to allow people who aren't economists to kind of figure out how they can be putting money into services. So Labour are all about funding things. They're all about kind of free access to education for all, so that everybody can upskill and not be restricted by their background and their lack of money. They're all about kind of equal opportunities and all about kind of trying to be more diverse and accepting of people, putting more money into the NHS, putting more money into police and crime and things like that. They've come up with a policy of putting broadband into rural communities. Like, access to broadband is something that will develop us as a country, and take people out of situations where they don't have information. Like, the reason why we're so intelligent now is because we have access to the internet, and there's lots of people in our country that are internet poor. So and internet's expensive as well, so some people can't afford to have the internet, and then they have to go to the libraries, but the libraries are being closed down because of cuts, whereas Labour are kind of like, well, they need to be funded. So Labour's all about spending money, which some people are against, because it's like, you're spending all this money and you haven't got a money tree and whatever. But the money is taken away from other things. So, for example, by increasing corporation tax on businesses and getting people who earn more than 80 grand a year to pay a little bit more tax, they're still going to be earning more than anybody else, even with all that tax. Because it is a lot of tax, and this is why people are against it. If you earn a lot of money and you look at your pay at the end and half of it's gone, like, you think, what's the point? But you are earning way more than anybody else in the country. So, it is kind of fair in that way. Like, why should you have more money than everybody else? But then, the argument might be, well, if you work, you get paid money because you work harder, then, you might be like, well, why would I want to vote for a party that's going to tax me more? So you might kind of like, that might sway your votes. But then I would argue that, could you be okay with having more money to spend each month if it meant that you had to walk past more people homeless on the street? Like, for me personally, I feel really bad every time I walk past someone who's homeless on the street. Like, I feel awful, because I just think, like, what's happened in that person's life that's meant that they're on the street. Like, God, I feel getting upset. They don't deserve to be, like, on the street, like, in the cold with no one to, like, help them and stuff. Like, and the impact on someone's mental health in that situation means that they're not going to be able to get themselves out of it. Like, it's going to be so difficult for them to get themselves out of it. And, like, you can't get a job because you don't have a fixed address, and you can't get a bank account, so you can't get paid from your job anyway. So there's loads of things that prevent you from then getting out of that hole that you're in. And sometimes people, like, I think you get kind of aware of these social problems when you come into contact with people that are suffering in situations. So in education, there's always, people are absent because they can't get into college or whatever, because they can't afford the bus fare, or they live too far away, and they kind of, they're accessing food banks because they can't afford to pay for food, and they've had problems. Like, there was one person that I used to support who, I say support, I only met him a couple of times because he didn't really come in, but he'd lost his mum, and he had no other family, and he had no income because he was a student. So he literally, like, had nothing, and and his mental health was really bad because that was the person that he was close to, and he kind of lost her and stuff. And it was like, I can see bad things happening for him. He was turned to substance abuse and things like that. And it's kind of, like, how do you kind of help people like that if there's no services, So Labour are kind of all about like spending money, but why would you not want to spend money if it meant that crime reduces? Why would you not want to spend money if it meant that NHS services were more efficient and people were getting help quicker and people weren't dying? Like, surely it's worth spending money. Surely it's worth going into a little bit of debt for that. I would argue that it was. But they're my values. They might not be the values of people that, it doesn't affect. If it doesn't affect you, you're less likely to see it. But if I was going to say, I see it all the time, around me all the time. So, and I feel awful about it. And so I kind of think that the way that the country is at the minute with the austerity and thing, there's too many cuts, that it's having such a detrimental impact on society, and it doesn't need to be. I think, we've had like a recession, our growth has been stagnated because of the banking crisis, but it's been made worse by austerity measures. It wouldn't have been as bad as this if spending was happening. You could do temporary spending and then, do austerity measures once everything's good again. Like that to me would make more sense. And also, this idea that Labour just spends and isn't fiscally responsible. There's some statistic or something that some kind of quantity measure that I read recently, which was that when the Labour and Conservative have been in power, Conservatives have actually spent more money than what Labour have, and that Conservatives have put us in more debt than what Labour have. So this fallacy of Labour spending money is just that, it's a fallacy. So that's something to kind of bear in mind. But then, you've got to think about, whilst the Labour policies are wanting to keep things like the Trident missile for defence, there is more of an ideology of kind of peace. And so there is a view from at least Jeremy Corbyn anyway to dismantle the Trident missile, and so that would leave us undefenceless. Would leave us, yeah. But then the argument would be, well, should we be, if we've got a missile, it means that if someone bombs us, we're going to have to bomb somebody else. We're going to have to cause a humanitarian crisis somewhere else. So I understand why Jeremy Corbyn wants to do that. I completely get it. I completely get why he is always kind of trying to bring about peace, and the only way you bring about peace is by talking to people, even if you don't agree with them, you don't like them, you don't agree with their values. The only way you can bring about peace is by talking to people, which is why he talks to a lot of groups that people seem to think that he's aligned with when he isn't. So I'm ranting about that, aren't I? Because this is kind of like my kind of values, but I'm trying to think of if there's any other bad things about Labour that people might think about and therefore not vote for them. They are perhaps a little bit liberal in terms of inclusivity of groups and things, which sometimes can go a bit too far left, I would think, for some people. So that's kind of something. And as well, they don't consider the impact of immigration on the country and its services, which is a conservative policy. Conservative policy are all about kind of like changing immigration policies. Like, we are suffering from overpopulation. It's something to kind of consider, and it is because of immigration. And so if immigration was done in a better way, then that wouldn't be so much of a problem. It's not necessarily that immigrants are an issue, they're not. It's the fact that the controls of immigration is the issue, because it's not taking into consideration things like integration into our culture and stuff like that. So we're getting a lot of crime related to differences in culture. So that's maybe something, a reason why people don't vote for Labour. But having said that, could you, if someone turned up at your door, like that, they were in humanitarian crisis, so this is theoretically starting to happen, someone turns up and they're dying and they need your help, would you turn them away and go, get out of my country? You wouldn't, would you? Like, you just would not do that. So it's kind of like, how as a human being can you stand by and watch people who have nothing? Like, if our situation in Britain was that we got bombed and, we had, our home was gone, our money was gone, our loved ones were gone, we'd been attacked and things like that, and we were trying to get into another country, would you not expect to be let in? Because I think, I would. So I understand that there's problems for the country that need addressing, but we can't just abandon people, I don't think, which is something that kind of needs to be considered. Now moving on to kind of the Green Party. Green Party are actually really forward thinking in their policies. They have a lot of good policies that they come up with before the other parties. They came up with a lot of policies that Labour have now adopted. I've got a sneaking suspicion that the broadband came from them. I don't know whether that. No, there was something else. Or free TV licence and the changes to VAT. That was a Green policy last election that I feel like maybe Labour has taken on board. So the good thing about Labour is that they take other good policies from other parties that they agree with. So you usually tend to find that they kind of get on, they agree with policies. Green Party, so as I mentioned, they're quite forward thinking, but they're very kind of dominant on the environment. So because they're dominant on the environment, they might neglect other things like education unless it's pertinent to the environment. So that might be kind of something to consider. Their focus and their slant is on the environment, so then they sometimes neglect other kind of viewpoints, if you will, that the other parties might take into consideration more. But having said that, we're in a climate crisis. We need to do things, and that their aim is to kind of meet targets and things, but I think it's 2025, whereas the other parties are like 2030, 2040, 2045, 2050. Like there's a kind of range of when they're going to actually meet the targets or go. They use it different terms and things to make reference to it in different ways, so that it's a bit like sneaky how they say it. So they say like carbon neutral, and then they say like half it by this date or whatever. It's in the manifestos if you need to have another look, but I would say that the Green Party are kind of wanting to do it sooner, but then I would wonder if that's idealistic because none of the other parties have said it that soon. Now, I don't know if that's because the other parties are trying to save face so that when they don't do it, they can say, well, I didn't say that it had to be by that date anyway, but the Green are like saying to do it straight away. So that might be kind of something to consider. Liberal Democrats are wanting to remain in the European Union without consulting the populace. So they're wanting to revoke Article 50 without referendums. So I've not even mentioned Brexit yet, ever, which is funny, because that's what everyone talks about. Obviously, Conservatives are wanting to get Brexit done. You've got to bear in mind that Brexit is not going to be done straight away. Like the actual, we made the decision to leave is going to be done, but then the negotiations about trade and the single market and everything else is gonna take years. It's gonna take a really long time, and that's gonna be whatever party gets in. Now, obviously, a lot of people that voted for Leave voted on misinformation. I don't know why I said a lot of people. I'm sure there's a lot of people that voted for Leave and made an informed choice about it and definitely still want to leave. Like, I'm not suggesting that they don't, but there were a few people that voted for Leave that wish that they'd had more information and wish that they'd, been able to make that decision. And personally, I didn't vote because I didn't feel like I had enough information, and I was listening to everyone thinking this doesn't sound right, this sounds fishy and stuff. So I didn't vote because I would have remained. On reflection now, I'm a little bit like, I don't actually know what would be better. All the economists and things are saying that leaving the European Union would mean that temporarily at least we would be, we'd have a decline in economic growth, and we'd probably feel like we were in austerity measures again. So it's probably not the best idea to do it at this point, given the state of the country at the minute. But I think it might be something that's worth thinking about in the future. Because then you do have more control over things, and you're not giving more money to the EU than what you're getting out of it. But then you still have things like security, exchanging of information, which is really useful, and that's all going to have to be negotiated, and it's going to put things in a little bit of a stage of unrest. So I don't think it's a good time to be leaving the European Union at this stage. So I would probably vote Remain based on that, hoping that maybe there might be another referendum in the future. But I completely understand why people want to leave. Like, I get it. But then there are people that would like just to kind of have a confirmation of whether they should be leaving, whether they should be remaining, and have all the information at hand and voting on what type of leave deal that we're going to get. Like, are we going to be part of the single market? Are we not? All that kind of information. Is there going to be a border in Northern Ireland? All that kind of stuff. So it would be kind of useful to have all that information before we had a referendum, which is why I probably agree with Labour in having a second one. I don't think that that's undemocratic, whereas I think that revoking it completely, like the Liberal Democrats are suggesting, is undemocratic, because basically what you're saying is you don't agree with most of what the people are saying in the country, so let's just not do it. Like, you can't do that. Like, that's really undemocratic, and I get why people who voted for the Leave are really annoyed about it. Also, Jo Swinson, like, I know you shouldn't really vote based on the person that's heading the party. They're a figurehead, but it's not, their party. Like, if you think about when I gave the example of Jeremy Corbyn wants to disband Trident, it's not in the manifesto. The manifesto is saying that it's going to keep it. So they don't get the kind of deciding vote. It depends what the majority of the party vote on and think. So, in terms of Jo Swinson, she's saying one thing, and a parliamentary voting record is completely saying the opposite. So I would go and check that out before you vote for Liberal Democrat. If you think about what happened with the coalition government, all the promises that Liberal Democrats made in terms of student fees and like university fees, that's what I was going to say, and other things that they mentioned, they completely just went back on, because they didn't. I guess they didn't have a choice because they were in coalition with the Conservatives. They didn't have a majority, and they were probably more kind of led by them. But with Liberal Democrats, it's a little bit, I think I saw something recently as well that was, I can't remember now. To be honest with you, I didn't look at the Liberal Democrat manifesto this time, because last time when I looked at them for the last election, I found that they were quite similar to Labour, but they were kind of more towards Conservative, so that they are in the middle of Conservative and Labour. So if you were kind of undecided between the two, you might pick Liberal Democrats. But what I would suggest is that you just compare them on things like how much investment they're going to make in services and what they're going to tax and stuff like that, because there are some slight differences between them. But I can't really give you that information because I haven't looked at the Liberal Democrat manifesto in detail, and I can't remember off the top of my head, like, what their policies were. But I thought the fact that they're revoking Article 50 without kind of having a referendum, I just thought that's just really undemocratic, and I wouldn't support a party like that. And particularly as well what they did with the student fees, I was like, no, they're not the party for me, really. And I think they're too kind of towards Conservative as well for me. I'm more leaning towards kind of Labour. So obviously, like with all the parties, it depends what your values are. It depends what you believe. It depends on how it affects you. I've just kind of given a brief overview there from my perspective of it, and the reasons why I've aligned with Labour. The other thing to kind of consider is you might want to vote tactically. It's unlikely that Greens are going to win the election. They might win more seats, and that obviously means that there's a representation in Parliament. But overall, you're probably going to have either a Conservative or a Labour government at this stage because of how many seats there are. So you've got to kind of ask yourself the question, what do you prefer? Do you prefer a Labour government? Do you prefer a Conservative government? And kind of make the choice between those two. Unless you're in, for example, if you're in a Labour strong constituency and you would prefer Labour over Conservative, then you might vote for Green because it doesn't matter. Green will then likely to get a seat, and they might get a seat, and then Labour will still win. So you can kind of vote tactically, and you can still get people in, because I think there should be representation from all parties. Really, I believe in the members of in the House of Commons. Like, that's the point of it. But I think you've got to look at the bigger picture and think, what impact is your vote going to have on the whole country? Like, is it going to sway the voting? If you vote for Greens, for example, in a Conservative held constituency, that's a vote for the Conservatives. So you've got to kind of put that in perspective. And if that's what you want to do, that's absolutely fine. But just bear in mind that's the impact of your vote. Or if you vote for an independent party or vote for whatever. I haven't mentioned UKIP because literally on the first page of the UKIP manifesto is some kind of sexism towards women. So I was like, well, this isn't the party for me. So maybe have a look at their manifesto before you vote for them. But they are kind of a very right-wing party, which we need, because you need an opposition to the left wing. You need somebody to kind of make you aware of what your views are. I'm about to run out of time, so hopefully this helps. Probably you made up your mind already anyway, but there you go. Good luck voting tomorrow. Let's hope that Labour get in.